We have a great agenda here for this morning. 2 sessions coming up, one on equity in adaptation and one on nature-based solutions. So we're going to have guest moderators today. So I'll introduce our first moderator. Her name is Taya Trifo. You saw her yesterday. She's our network coordinator at ClimateWest. And Taya was raised on Treaty 4 territory in Regina. She recently completed her Master of Arts in Resources, Environment, and Sustainability. And in both her research and her work, Taya is passionate about making adaptation planning processes more equitable. Her master's research focused on equity in the City of Vancouver's Rain City strategy. Welcome, Taya.
Okay, thanks so much, Kara. Yeah, I'm super honored to be the one that gets to moderate all our fantastic speakers for the equity session today. So maybe what I'll do is just invite you to come and join us here at the panel table. So then that way we can run the session together. Yeah. So we have 4 excellent speakers. And while they're coming up, I just wanted to give a little bit of a background. So this session is called Ensuring that Investments in Adaptation are Equitable. So our 4 speakers here today will be sharing a little bit more about what equity means to them and why it's so critical in adaptation planning while we're moving forward on that. So our first speaker today is Karina Cardona Claros, and she's with the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. And Karina has been engaged with matters of environment and health for over 20 years and has lived with a spinal cord injury since age 13. And combining academic pursuits with personal experience, her research has focused on mobility and health equity for seniors, for youth, and persons with disabilities in urban and rural communities. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Karina. And just a note on questions, we'll do the same as yesterday. We'll save them for the end. So keep those questions up here, then make sure to put them in the Mentimeter later on.
Good morning. So you can see on the screen a title that says Cripping Climate Adaptation, Disability Justice and Climate Change. So cripping means it's a reclamation of a word that was used derogatorily for people with disabilities for a long time. And so this means to put kind of the disability identity into something. And so this has been something that I've been working on with ClimateWest funding for a project that I worked on. A film that we've made. And so this is what I'm going to tell you about today. As well, I'm going to show you a clip of the film. So I was invited in late 2020, early 2021 to participate in the development of a film on what does disability justice have to do with climate change. And Laura Cameron, who was a research associate at the Prairie Climate Center at the time, invited me into this project to do this work. The short film was intended to be about 2 minutes long. And as we got to doing interviews, we just didn't really know how to pare it down because it's a very complex issue. And with good fortune, we were allowed to keep going and make it a little bit longer to include more substantive information for the Climate Atlas. So I was really grateful to be invited. And this was a little social media meme I put out to see if I could recruit a few more people. But at the end of the day, for the most part, we ended up deciding that it wasn't going to just be about lived experience at large. We collected some really strong voices of people that do research, of people that do policy analysis, of people that do advocacy work. And so we gained perspectives to build on everyone's strengths, and everybody that's in the film lives with disabilities. So you get to hear our voices in this film, as well as uncover what are some next steps that we might need to take. Oh. So disability is significant within the population, but a lot of people live with social isolation or don't get to participate in society in the same way as many others do, and the economy, when it comes to jobs, when it comes to schooling. So there's a lot of invisibility around disability. There's also a lot of invisibility for disabilities that you just can't see, that people experience in their own way, with processing with their mind, with maybe a different way of seeing than we might. So we don't always know when somebody is disabled, but it's about 1 in 5 people in Canada. For the working age population, it's about 22%. For seniors, it gets closer to 40. And so about 9 out of 10 people that live with disability become disabled throughout their life. Only about 1 in 10 people are born with a condition that would lead to something like this. And so you can kind of expect that whoever's disabled now, there might be more people later on. You know, I personally didn't expect to become disabled, but I did. And I can't always walk, but today I can. And so there's this ebb and flow of being in the world that's a little bit different sometimes when you have a disability, and it's hard to explain. Being in the environmental sector for a long time, in my late teens and early 20s, it was just hard to find a place where that was understood and where it felt like I could participate effectively, mostly because so much of the work was really focused on individual behaviors and like environmentally positive behaviors. I do cycle, so I love that. I don't drive. I cycle as much as I can, walk as much as I can, but that is a sacrifice and it is difficult. And it's also not something that you can expect all people with disabilities to do. So, for example, when I was working at the Manitoba Eco Network and the car co-op was getting going about, and it was launched, and about 10 years ago, I said, what about an accessible vehicle? They'd had less than 10 at the time. And they said, well, it's just totally beyond affordability for us. But now we have, I think, over 80 vehicles. There's a car co-op parking spot at my building. And I think there's still no accessible vehicle. So it's just kind of like, keep getting a little bit forgotten. And this film gave me this chance to bring together a few stories that would illuminate why this might be the case. But when it comes to disability and climate adaptation, what we've noticed more is probably in situations of extreme events where the mortality rates are higher, where people with disabilities are 2 to 4 times more likely to die in an event, far more likely to be left behind, a lot harder to enumerate, what are the outcomes for if you experienced adverse health outcomes. That isn't really documented very well yet. And so we're still getting to the place where we need to put this on the map so that we understand how to respond effectively. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So my graduate work was looking at mobility in the neoliberal city. But one of the lenses that I use to look at exclusion and inclusion is something that David Sibley asked in Geographies of Exclusion, which is, who are spaces for, whom do they exclude, and how are those prohibitions maintained in practice? And so for me, I look at this through different scales when it comes to disability, because most people understand disability through like the body as of an individual. They think it's like inherent to someone, and it's usually viewed in negative terms. And that is one aspect of it. You do have needs that are different than other people's, and you might have had some difference in your body, some change that needs to be attended to. So we can't ignore that. But then as a group, this speaks to us, it isn't uniform. Like you saw in the previous chart, there's different kinds of disabilities. And so those needs are different. And throughout the lifespan, those needs are also different because of the way that you are connected to community or not. Beyond that, I think more people know about the social determinants of health these days. And so we think about what are the economic factors, where are people living, and we can kind of start to build a better picture of how people with disabilities are living in society or are not participating. And so you'll see that there's higher rates of unemployment. People who are unhoused in Winnipeg are more likely to be disabled. When it comes to risk with climate change, for example, people with schizophrenia, the medication that they need to take predisposes them to really adverse effects with heat. And so you're more likely to have this kind of combination where it's probably made it harder to hold a job, and it might have led you to not be housed. And now you're on medication also that makes you sick when the heat hits. And so you're more likely to have a very significant reaction in a heat dome event. And that happened in Montreal. And so that's when that became noticed in the, just before 2020, when we started making the film. Since we started making the film, there's been more significant events, and kind of like Chris spoke to yesterday with the catastrophic events, you know, we report the deaths. We don't really talk so much about what were those adverse health outcomes and events for people that didn't die. And so that's data that we're still kind of looking to connect. But all is to say that there's a much higher risk for people with disabilities. This is acknowledged in literature in the National Adaptation Strategy. The newest adaptation strategy mentions disability several more times. Can't remember if it's 12 or 20, but it mentions it a lot more than the previous one did. Not necessarily that there's a plan in place to deal with it, but just to say that we're building recognition of it. And so in my experience from undergrad to graduate work to where I am now, I feel like, okay, there's audiences now that have caught up to that understanding and we can have these conversations. So I'm so happy to be here for this reason. In my work, I deal with investments in terms of donors giving us money to support the work that we do as health messengers on climate change. So CAPE does a lot of really significant work on addressing fossil fuels and the health effects of fossil fuels in our society. And we're just on the cusp now of building in more equity as well, applying for more equity focused projects, building more equity into our organization. And by that, I mean representation. By that, I mean prioritizing issues, leaning into funding partners, such as like the Definity Insurance Foundation has really started to carve out a space for organizations within Canada to do equity focused work around climate adaptation. So there's these vessels for us to be able to kind of, you know, lean into, pour into, and collaborate. And so it's a really good time now to be thinking about equitable investments. So further to what I'm saying right now is like, CAPE developed the Climate Change Toolkit for Health Professionals, which has helped to build a lot of capacity across Canada within the medical community. The Climate Atlas also hosts a video with a CAPE represented doctor who speaks to climate and health. And and I don't know if this was discussed yesterday, because I think Amber Bennett is doing a session with us on Saturday, but I think also spoke yesterday. But with climate change communications, health is something that we all share in common. It's something that we can all understand. It's a nonpartisan issue. We all want the best outcomes we can have. And so it's a really important message to connect. But as I showed in the previous slide, health it's not just a person's body. It's the way that this has also led to other outcomes in their lives. So the film that we developed aimed to, I'm just going to give like a little bit of the preview of the first few minutes that you won't see. I've done a little bit already. It speaks to kind of the proportion of people with disabilities, the risk that we run, how many people are left behind. And where I will start off is at addressing the underpinning of the assumption that disabled people can be left behind. So we're going to start with ableism and we're going to end with climate change in this clip. Excuse me. Excuse me. So a common understanding of disability is the medical model of disability. So working with a physician-led organization, there's a lot of trust needed from people with disabilities, from the medical community. Mostly because a lot of the opportunities and benefits that we receive have to be done through a screening process with physicians, and we don't always get the recognition that we need and the supports that we need. So there's a trust building that needs to happen, but dating back to like predating eugenics, the medical model really like focused that disability was inherent to an individual. As rights-based advocacy came onto the board pretty much in the 70s and 80s, we started looking at the social model of disability, which looked at barriers in society and looked at the need for disabled people to have rights. And so in the film clip, you'll see a little bit about why there was such a huge lag on disabled people having equal rights in society. And so my work focuses more on the social spatial aspect of it, which is the place-based stuff, which is like, how does space play a role in this? And that's really important for people in this room, because some of you work at different scales. You might work in a municipality, you might work for the province, you might work for the federal government, you might work for a different organization that addresses housing or that addresses food. But these are all kind of like spaces and containers that we can look at. How are disabled people involved in that assessment and process? Sorry about this. So adverse events, I've mentioned a clip that you won't see is where I ask, what needs will you have in an emergency, but also what needs aren't met yet. So that's the disability justice piece of it. What needs aren't being met yet. Because everyday life, if we don't sort out how it is that we address disability in everyday life and in our built environment and in our systems, it will be really hard to help people in these major events and these crises. So it's part of a continuum. Like Mary said yesterday, climate change is with us. It's here now. So climate change is going to be part of everyday life, and these adverse events are just going to be some portion of it. And so the film clip that you'll see is going to focus on that. So I'm so grateful to the Climate Atlas for this opportunity to put together a collective story of inclusive filmmaking. It was made during the pandemic when we weren't even allowed into people's homes, really. And so we worked to get equipment to people and, proper audio and visual so that we could collect their stories. Some people's stories we couldn't include because the quality wasn't really good enough. We interviewed a few more people than you see on the screen here, but they were focusing more on solutions, even though they were represented populations we wanted in the film. We ended up making it a case study on mobility because of the connection to fossil fuels. And so you'll hear a few concepts that you might not have heard before to help to illustrate this case study. Most of the people are in Manitoba, but there's a couple of people, one person's in Alberta and one person's in Quebec. A few of them are professors. So Sebastian, for example, runs the Disability Inclusive Climate Action Research Program out of McGill University. He has a Canada Research Chair in Health and the Environment. Nancy is the Director of Disability Studies here at U of M. And Kevin, who you see below, was involved with Erica McPherson, a co-director and the editor of the film, who also made a project, People First, about deinstitutionalization across Canada. So they trace this journey of advocacy. So he's speaking to that. Debbie Patterson, you'll see maybe a clip from a performance that she did with the Winnipeg Contemporary Dancers called Crutch. And Alan was just awarded the Queen's Jubilee Medal for his work. So I'll ask Dean to play the clip. And can we turn down the lights, or is that an option? I don't know if we need.
I'm sexually discriminated because of my ability diversity, or I'm not fitting ability norms. Everyone would expect certain abilities, whether it's body-related ones, like some people expect to walk, but then it's also the ability to have simply a good life, right? Which is the ableism.
Ableism is a set of beliefs that assumes that people with disabilities are somehow empirically inferior and evaluates a person's worth based on our ability to produce. Climate change and ableism share a similar worldview, that the earth exists as a source of wealth. Any area of the earth that isn't being exploited for its full monetary value is not serving the greater good in some way.
The term fossil-fueled ableism describes this connection between the expectations of what bodies are for and climate change that dates back to the Industrial Revolution. We call it the design apartheid. The Industrial Revolution happened. People's bodies became labor in a whole new way to produce profit. And if you couldn't do that in a certain way, we had to figure out what to do with you. And so we became institutionalized. And so cities built up without disabled people participating in them. And now, as we're dealing with climate change, we need to change that.
A lot of things that have been done to make the environment more environmentally friendly in general for the non-disabled population. has been developed without meaningful consultation of disabled people in the first place. And it acts to exclude people with disabilities. So say if you close a lot of streets to motor vehicle traffic, that stops me from using that street. The new bike lanes that have been put in downtown Winnipeg that have little ridges in it that make it impossible for me to cross the street now. Nobody can drop me off near where those bike lanes are because they can't use them either. So there is this environmental ableism that assumes that everybody uses their body in the same way, that assumes that everybody stands up, is two-legged, and has a limitless amount of energy.
In my conversations with people in the field of climate change, talking to them about the importance of disability inclusion, I've received pushback. So I'll give the example of, for a transition to a low carbon society, we need a mass transit that's accessible to people with disabilities. So making your system accessible in the long run reduces costs and actually makes it more accessible, not just to people who have mobility or visual impairments, but people with strollers, people carrying their bikes, older people. It really does make sense. And I've had pushback from climate experts who would say, well, that would cost too much. And it's fascinating that someone who's the climate activist is saying, basically, let's invest less in mass transit. So some people do have these ableist ideas that, a mass transit system can be okay, even if it's not accessible for 15 to 20% of your population.
For disabled people, our citizenship isn't fully realized. We're blocked from participation in society in so many ways. So with certain legislation that we have in place now, we're going to be working to reduce barriers. This is actually our chance to move away from that design apartheid and actually rebuild cities in ways that include more people, like to change transit ways, to change infrastructure in consideration of disability.
The way we structure our care systems, our social services, our other supports, it's important to look at all those systems as well. We've seen some of the things that are happening due to climate change, and we need to prepare for them. Not just thinking about what do we need to do to mitigate flooding or whatever, and we need to ensure that people with disabilities, they help co-create that better future, and that they're not just an afterthought in some of these processes.
Disability is administered by government and in society and is monitored in so many ways. It's shaped so much by policy. So when it comes to climate, it's one of those cross-cutting issues where it just requires lots of collaboration from different levels of government and is a very complex issue about how we live and who deserves what. And so how do we connect those dots? And how can our voices and our experiences be counted for when we design those new systems?
People need to be treated as equal. It's not 1900 anymore. People need to wake up, especially the government.
Whether it's policy development or planning, or whether it's governments or NGOs doing that work, we need to look around the table, see who's there, see who's not, and if they're not there, why aren't they there, and how can we get them there?
For us to really hold states accountable in terms of respecting and protecting the rights of people with disabilities in the context of climate change, we were going to have to start insisting on our inclusion. We have a new Accessible Canada Act, and yet we still have a climate adaptation strategy that doesn't include people with disabilities. So there are some inconsistencies, and maybe sometimes those are so grave that they take the form of human rights violations, and in that case, litigation is the appropriate response.
Order in the court!
All over the world, there's lawsuits that have been launched against governments on human rights grounds, and there's some by young people, and there's some by old people, and there's some by Indigenous people. And now there is a case to recognize and include the rights of people with disabilities in responses to climate change.
People with disabilities or people who...
So, thank you. Yeah, within that where Nancy speaks to the bike lanes, she's referring to handy transit. The ramp doesn't necessarily reach across. So, you know, everywhere you could be dropped off, you can no longer be dropped off. But the conflict with that is that the studies show that there's a huge reduction in fatalities for cyclists if you set up protected bike lanes. And so, you know, there's alternatives sometimes where you can have like little bumps that have spots in between. And so wheels for a wheelchair or otherwise, you know, walkers or canes can make their way through. So sometimes you can flex on these adaptations. It doesn't have to be one way or the other. And it's creating that kind of colorful space and that thinking that just leads to better solutions. And concepts like it's not reinventing the wheel, you know, 8 to 80 cities, where if you build cities for children and people who are, you know, seniors, you're probably going to make sure your city is accessible and better for everybody in between. So it's thinking about how these concepts can apply to the processes that we're going through right now and thinking through what are the strengths that I have that I can bring to this. In the film, we talk about the adaptation toolkit from the disability community and why it's so extensive. And it's because we're constantly having to try to figure out how to participate in spaces and places that don't expect us, advocating for yourself or, you know, making changes that you might not want, but you have to accept. So for me, developing a spinal cord injury, what really resonated with me about we're never going back with climate, like with whatever temperature we land at. Yeah, with a spinal cord injury, you're never going back. You just have to accept what happened. And the first 2 years after it happens is when you have the best outcomes if you put in the best work. After that, your gains are going to be much more minimal. And so I think about the same thing with climate adaptation. The sooner we do this planning, the more we invest now, the better returns we're going to get. You know, the longer we wait, we're going to have fewer options and we're going to get lower returns. And so there's this kind of parallel that I think I've experienced and I see within the disability community that's really helpful for this situation. Sorry, I'm probably going over now. So only 2 more things. So the next slide, we are getting more attention for this film. We're going to be hosting a community conversation at it that will be a hybrid event during Research Week at the U of W in November. So we'll be able to invite you to that. If you're interested in participating, you can stay in touch with the Prairie Climate Center about that. I'll switch to the next slide. Oh, I have to do it. Sebastian, who's in the film, is doing some really amazing research to identify like systemic and a systematic analysis looking at policies, 85 policies across Canada, all levels of government. How are people with disabilities being included or not? What kind of research is needed? He also has a podcast that you can follow. So we're going to be leaning into more work with him, mostly because he's also in communication with Minister Qualtrough. So this is what I'm leaving you with, which is just to think of this as like and not as a criticism of what you're doing or not doing, but just appreciative inquiry. Like, what are the strengths that I have that I can contribute to this? If you're a data person, is there some sort of one aspect of data that you're collecting that you could cross-tabulate and include disabilities so that we can capture a better picture? If you're doing GIS, can we look at how we can overlay the social determinants with some of these like policy-related concerns for exclusion and inclusion so that we can get a better picture both for risk or for solution building. And so just to think about what strengths you might have that you can contribute to this, not really to think you have to reinvent anything. We're all just a piece of the puzzle, like you see in the film. No one person had the whole answer. Everybody contributed their snippet and it told the story. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Karina. All the panelists have the perk that I get to keep their seats warm for them while they're presenting. So I'll soon take Marlene's seat because she's about to join us. So Marlene Doyle is from Crown-Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada. Marlene's academic and professional background has focused on advancing collaborative approaches to environmental monitoring and assessment with the focus on community-based monitoring and citizen science. Marlene has worked with the Ecological Monitoring and Assessment Network, Nature Watch, and has contributed toward the development and implementation of the Arctic Council's Arctic Terrestrial Biodiversity Monitoring Plan. So thank you, Marlene.
Morning. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you here on Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Red River Métis. I'm just going to get started. Okay, so yesterday we heard a lot about the impacts of climate change, and these impacts are being felt disproportionately by Indigenous communities across Canada. Some of these impacts are very severe and acute, such as wildfires and floods. And in fact, the evacuation rate for First Nations is actually 18 times higher than non-Indigenous Canadians. Other impacts include a shortened winter road season or more fragile transportation networks, which can impact the ability to bring important resources and food to remote communities. Also, it's changing the distribution and abundance of culturally important species or country food species that communities may rely on as a complementary food source. Also, it's making travel on the land unsafe because of uncertain ice conditions or conditions on the land and uncertain weather, dangerous weather. So all of this is compounding impacts, including changes to food security, mental health and wellness, connection to the cultural community, and overall well-being. And some of these impacts are compounded by pre-existing socio-cultural vulnerabilities. So there are a number of programs in place to support Indigenous communities with that adapting to the impacts of climate change. I'll be speaking to 3 of these, but a little later in my talk, I'll provide a link where if folks are interested, they could find many more. So the first I'll mention is the First Nation Adapt program. This is managed out of Crown-Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, and it provides funding for First Nations south of 60 to conduct studies and assessments which relate to mitigating climate risk to community infrastructure and as well as reducing disaster risk. There's an important element of this program related to mitigating flood risk. So a lot of studies are supported related to flood mapping and hazard assessment. Other areas of focus include winter roads, coastal erosion, wildfire, and sea level rise. Okay, the second program is actually the program that I manage. It's called the Indigenous Community-Based Climate Monitoring Program. And this program supports First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, as well as groups that don't affiliate with those distinctions all across Canada, to monitor climate and the impacts of climate change using Indigenous knowledge systems and science. So the projects we support are very much community-based, driven by the priorities of the local community, and they self-determine what they monitor, where and how. So it's everything from sea ice to caribou to water quality, very diverse. And the intent here is to really build that community capacity to monitor these changes over the long term. The last one I'm going to mention is the Climate Change and Health Adaptation Program, which is managed out of Indigenous Services Canada. And this program provides funding for Indigenous groups, both First Nations and Inuit, to conduct studies related to the impacts of climate change on health. Health, as Karina mentioned, being such a crucial uniter. So there's many different aspects that communities could seek funding for example, studies related to availability of traditional medicines, food security, a lot of food security work, also looking at air and water quality, mental health and wellness, and other items. Another great program. So there are many, many examples of Indigenous-led activities related to adaptation and mitigation across Canada. This map is just showing the locations of the projects that have been supported by our program, as well as the First Nation Adapt program over the last 5 years or so. But this is by no means an exhaustive sort of map of all the Indigenous-led work being done across the prairies. And you could go to the Climate Atlas and find more stories. You can go find out more about what's happening in your local community. And each one of those dots kind of represents an important story, and in many cases a success in terms of how the communities are generating their own information to inform and adapt to climate change. We'll be hearing about one of these, which is Black River First Nation, in a couple of minutes. Lanielle introduced this yesterday in her talk. So there is an initiative underway called the Indigenous Climate Leadership Agenda, which is a co-development process between Canada's Indigenous peoples and the Crown to really co-develop a new vision for what Indigenous leadership with respect to climate change means. So it's being undertaken on a distinctions-based basis, which means there's tailored ways of implementing or developing this for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And the objectives of the initiative is really to identify ways to remove systematic barriers for Indigenous people in terms of accessing the resources that they need to take their own self-determined actions to address climate change, to also ensure that Indigenous peoples have a voice at the table in terms of climate policy and decision-making, and also to really transform fundamentally the way that this climate action work undertaken by Indigenous peoples is resourced. These are a few resources where you could go to find more information about exciting projects that are underway, and also tools to, if you are an Indigenous community and you're interested in learning more about other projects, you can find many resources on these sites. I believe that these presentations will be shared, so I won't go through them in detail, but they provide really useful, I think, and relevant resources for climate and health work, monitoring, and general adaptation. The link at the bottom is the link I mentioned earlier, where you can find a pretty comprehensive list of programs that are targeted for Indigenous peoples related to the environment and climate change. So I'm going to close here just with a few reflections. I thought it could be potentially useful if you were, considering undertaking your work in partnership with Indigenous peoples, sort of like Karina was mentioning, perhaps there's an element of your work that could uplift Indigenous rights or support Indigenous benefit. So here are some thoughts, and I've drawn these both from my own personal work, but also from the resources that are shared on the subsequent slide. Sorry, I'm getting nervous. So firstly, it's important to engage with the local community and identify what are the needs of the community, and come to that conversation with some reflections about your own positions of power and your biases and what you're bringing, and also being very respectful of the community's protocols, their culture and customs, and their authority. Wherever possible, look for opportunities to uplift the community and leave a lasting legacy through your partnership by really hardwiring or building in that capacity at a community level to really take the next step and be leaders on climate change. Ensure that you're coming back to share the results of the work you've done together routinely, using language that's understandable and clear, and also to ensure to recognize the contributions of your Indigenous partners. And finally, just remember that sometimes relationship building and trust building can take time. So make space for that in your project. Okay, that's it. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks so much, Marlene. And now we have our last two co-presenters here. So super excited to be introducing you. So we have Jack Johnson and we have Bob Austman from Black River First Nation. So I'll start with Jack's bio. So Jack was born and raised in Dauphin, Manitoba. He resides in Lorette, Manitoba, where he and his wife have raised 3 fantastic children. Jack also has 8 marvelous grandchildren. He has been employed in a variety of jobs, making him an authentic jack of all trades. And one of his favorite jobs was working with the Black River First Nation, where he did a proposal and report writing, as well as managing a number of other programs and projects. Jack retired in March of 2015, but is still involved in projects for Black River First Nation. And then also Bob. So Bob is a former science teacher with over 25 years experience working with youth. And Bob worked for the Manitoba Model Forest for 15 years as an education coordinator, conducting research into sustainable forest management and educating the public about ecological goods and services from the forest. And then he taught adult education in Black River First Nation, and he transitioned into environmental work for the community where he has spent the last 5 years on climate change monitoring program. So let's welcome Jack and Bob.
Morning. I'm Jack of the Jack and Bob Show. I just want to take a minute or so to give you a bit of an overview of what Bob's going to be presenting. I rehearsed this last night and it took 1 minute and 28 seconds, so it's not going to be my fault if we go over our allotted time. I worked for Black River First Nation for over 13 years, and we got our first climate change monitoring program started in 2012. And it turned into a 3-year project, went from 2012 through 2015. And the objective of that project was to kind of get a feeling for what the First Nation people thought of climate change and how they saw the future with it and that kind of thing. We had a core group of participants made up of elders, other community members, and a few youth. And they, after the 3 years, and I think we had 6 separate workshops, we had all of their opinions, their outlooks on climate change and all that information first. Then we invited a couple of scientific minds to contribute their opinions. And it was very amazing as to the similarities between the two groups, what they were both saying. That 3-year project kind of triggered the interest in climate change monitoring in the community. And we kept going. I think Bob and I started working together in 2016, 2017. And we just did project after project. And we eventually evolved into doing our projects with the grades 9 and 10 science classes from the Anishinaabe School. None of our projects would have been possible had it not been for the support and cooperation that we received from, first of all, the Black Nation governance body. Councillor Bird is sitting with us here, so we thank them. The principals and teachers at the school were tremendous in supporting us, and as well as their staffs. CERNAC for the funding, and so we wanted to give a big thanks to all of those people and their groups. We have put together a booklet called Black River First Nation 10 years of climate monitoring, or a decade of climate monitoring. And it kind of gives a brief description of all the different projects we've been involved with. We might have missed 1 or 2, but we got quite a bit of it in there. We hope to have that publication done or put online to share with everybody through the Indigenous Climate Monitoring Toolkit website. It won't be up before sometime around the middle of June, because we have 1 more workshop that we want to get in there and show the results of it, because we've got some of the science, grade 9 science students are going to be doing presentations at that workshop. So on climate change to the rest of the community. So with that, and I hope I didn't go over my minute 28, I'm going to turn it over to Bob and he'll fill in some detail on the projects.
Thank you, Jack. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to use my teacher's voice here after so many years in the classroom. Everybody can hear me? Okay, everybody's awake? You young man in the back, please wake up. I had to throw that in. Anyway, I'd like to give everybody sort of an overview of what we've been working on up in the community for these last several years. And we'll go with the first one here. So we start out with basic meteorology. We can't talk about climate change without understanding the basics of what is an air mass, what is the polar vortex, what is relative humidity, and talking about some of the inputs that are in the computer model. So this is done in the classroom setting before we get out and do the field work. But of course, the grade 9s are always chomping at the bit to get out there and do the field work. But these are some of the things we discuss, including the wonky jet stream that has been acting very strangely the last couple of years. So we'll go on the NOAA website and we'll look at what the situation is with the jet stream and talk about why we're getting temperatures warmer in Nunavut than it is in North Dakota, which has been happening. So it's, again, as Professor Danny Blair said yesterday, extreme variability is the name of the game, and we've been seeing that all over the place. Whoops, I fell for that one as well. Okay, the keystone part of our project is a remote weather station that we built a couple of years ago, and I have to say this is made by the Hoskins Scientific using Hobo software. And what we can do is we used to download the climate data or weather data with the students every Thursday when we went up to the community, but now we can do it remotely. We've got a Wi-Fi link that just is now broken. We have to do some technical stuff to get it up and running. But I passed out some sample printouts of the weather data we get and made it very clear to the students that, you know, by the time they graduate, we still don't have that 30-year picture that you need for climate data. This is only weather data. So we talked about that as well. Again, the students are just chomping at the bit to get out in the field. And this is just a typical day where we're out doing some snow depth monitoring. And the data that we collect is on a 100-meter transect. We have meter sticks every 10 meters. So we go out there once a week and measure the snowfall. And that data has been shared with Manitoba Conservation, and they used to plug it into a computer model that will determine the winter kill for local ungulate animals, that is hoofed animals, moose, deer, caribou, etc. And as you can see by the smiles on their face, they love getting outside. These kids don't complain about the cold. In this slide, we're looking at, we're studying invasive species, especially rusty crayfish, the spiny water flea, and we're looking at zebra mussels. And what we're doing is we're taking samples along the Black River, which is, we're very close to the mouth of the river in that particular shot. And the kids are taking in the traps to see if we've collected any of these invasive species, which are getting the upper leg now that the temperatures are warmer. They're having a lower mortality. The larvae are surviving longer and longer with the warmer conditions. So it is a serious concern in the community. We collect water samples both winter and summer, and then we analyze the oxygen content, of course, as you know, from your other science classes. Everybody knows that warm water holds less oxygen, right? So in a warming climate, you're going to have reduced oxygen, yet you're going to have the same biological oxygen demand, which means you could get fish kills, you could get toxic algae blooms and all other nasty things happening to the fresh water. The highways, these are the highways for the community in Black River. Trappers, hunters, fishers make their way onto the lake, and we've had some serious problems. We've had some mortality. We had some drownings with the thinning ice situations. We know that the winter roads are opening later and closing earlier. That's a big concern because there are communities further up the lake shore on this beautiful lake, which happens to be the 10th largest freshwater lake in the world, by the way. And so people travel up and down there all the time. So safety is becoming increasingly important, especially for those that are fishing and hunting and trapping. Jack and I also have a little side project here. We tried to we are reintroducing the monarch butterfly back into the community. We're basically at the northern range of the monarch butterfly. And we belong to a group called Monarch Watch. And what we do is I bring up larvae and raise them, and then we release them into the community. And there aren't as many around, according to the elders, as there used to be, because they are getting hammered by climate change as well. The population is down over the 30-year average. So we have to be cognizant of that, and we're trying to do our part as, you know, bringing in these pollinators for the community. Again, during COVID, of course, it also coincided with a major 2-year back-to-back drought, which dropped the water level in Lake Winnipeg significantly and made it very difficult for commercial fishers to do their job and to harvest the fish. It also destroyed a lot of fish spawning habitats. So that could actually wipe out a whole year class of pickerel and other species in the lake that the locals depend on. In our studies of climate, again, looking at invasive species, these are the remnants of zebra mussels that got washed up on the eastern shore of Lake Winnipeg. But we don't find many adults. The water coming in from the eastern Canadian Shield is very low in calcium, unlike the waters coming in from the western side of the lake around Gimli, Riverton, Arborg, and so on. There's more calcium in the soil, so that calcium is used to build the shells of the zebra mussel. So we don't have that many adults coming in from the east side, but these are all continually washed up during storms and so on. So we hope the adults do not get a foothold in there. Again, oh, sorry, this slide is out of place. We look at oxygen saturation. This one is about, you can see that one of the helpers on the board wrote 66.4%, which isn't bad for midwinter. It's not the greatest, but it's not anywhere near the danger zone. We also periodically study the shoreline along the Black River, the O'Hanley River, looking for erosion. There is concern with the increasing number of storms in Lake Winnipeg. It is creating a wave action at the mouth of the river, or the community is, and it's being so bad that at one spot in the community, the Anglican Church cemetery is actually getting undercut by bank erosion. So the community will have to deal with that. And that again is a direct result of the increased storms with our changing climate. We also have 2 forest plots that we monitor long-term. So in this slide, you can see the students using what they call an increment borer. We're drilling into the tree to look at the tree rings to determine the age of the species. And what we're doing is we're looking for disturbances in the forest related to wind damage, insect damage, that sort of thing. And we track the diameter of the trees yearly, and we look at things like insect infestations. And we've had a bit of a problem with spruce budworm in the region. So this area is also affected by that, because spruce budworm is not, the larvae are surviving longer and longer. And here we're just taking the core out of that spruce tree, black spruce tree, and looking at the age. And again, looking at the smiles in their face. I'm not sure if they're smiling because they're having fun out there, or they're actually getting less of a math lesson that day when they get back. But through the program, we're able to buy this equipment, the weather station and this ice auger and the sled to drag our equipment out there. And we make use of that equipment. The students really enjoy looking at that. So we're monitoring ice thickness over time, looking to see how that's changing from year to year. And again, that's basically not only the Black River, that's the highway to the lake. And so you always see snowmobiles, you see trucks, you see cars going up there to the river. And again, safety is a big concern with our warming climate. We have to make sure that people are aware of the dangers. For example, my grade 9s can recite the formula for ice thickness safety. You take the thickness of the ice, let's say 6 inches of ice, you square it, 36, add 2 zeros, it can carry 3,600 pounds. So we also make sure that they're checking with that ice auger before they go out, and are also traveling with somebody else in case they run into danger. So in short, I always look forward to my Thursdays up in Black River with my science students. Jack joins us sometimes in the classroom to help out. And again, I want to thank CERNAC for the support for buying the equipment, that we can work with the science kids and give them a real taste of hands-on science that has a meaningful message. That is, we have to monitor our climate to make sure that we can adapt and change. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much, everyone. I know that we're running a little bit short on time. What is new? That is okay. So I think maybe what we'll do here is let's take one question from the Mentimeter. And then my personal promise to you is that maybe those top 3 questions, I'll follow up personally with the panelists afterwards, and we'll try to include some of those responses to those questions in the forum report that we're including afterwards. But this is a really great conversation, so thanks so much for sharing. So the question that we have here, people with disabilities need to be a part of decision making but in most of the city council committees, there's no representation of them. How could it be ensured for climate change decisions? So that's a really good question about disability, and maybe we could expand it a little bit to talk about representation more broadly as well, so that each person on the panel could have a chance to talk about representation in the ways that apply to you. So let's start off with Karina, and does she have her mic here?
It's on. Well, for the city of Winnipeg, they have an advisory council, so it does sit outside of it, but there is representation there. And I know that in the past, I've also presented to other committees, and so those are kind of brought forward. It's not that there's no voices present whatsoever, and there are staff also that are disabled that do represent. So I would say there is efforts being made, but you're right, we need to be at the table where decisions are made. I agree.
Sorry, is this on? Is this working? Yeah. Yeah, I think I would challenge and encourage everyone here, everyone listening or on the line to think about how decision-making processes that they're part of could be made more inclusive to people of differing abilities, Indigenous peoples, all the communities, especially the vulnerable communities that you wish to represent. Through the Government of Canada, the space, as I mentioned, through the Indigenous Climate Leadership Co-Development process is really looking to see how, at least through that federal Indigenous relationship, that those decision-making processes can be made more equitable and inclusive.
Whenever we host a workshop in a community, we often invite elders. We try to make accommodations for giving them assistance, getting in and out of a vehicle, trying our best to make sure that their needs are met during the workshop. Jackie, anything you want to add to that?
No, I'm good.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much. That's really great. Yeah, I think with that, we'll conclude this panel, but thank you so much again, and let's give them a nice round of applause.